Welcome builders. So today we're going to talk about configuration files. We're going to start by going over kind of what configuration files are and why they're important. Then we're going to hop into Visual Studio and take a look at different ways configuration files are implemented. And then finally I'm going to finish up by telling a little bit of a personal story about configuration files and how I learned my lesson on why they're important. So let's get started. To start, a configuration file allows you to specify a set of values outside of your compiled application. So, when building your application, you can essentially hard code things, or you can make things configurable. Anything that's in your configuration file can then be changed after it's been compiled. So it allows you to do things like, let's say you have a database connection. That's going to be dynamic. So you wouldn't want to hard code a database connection into your application, because what if you get a new database server? Or maybe you have your code deployed to a dev environment versus a production environment. Well, ideally, those two are going to be separate database instances. So you'll want to be able to deploy a single compiled application, but then configure it differently based on that environment. Or let's say, for example, you're connecting to a third-party API and you're given an API key to access that API. Well, let's say that API key is only good for 1 year and then it expires. Well, you wouldn't want to hard code that value into your application. You'd want to make it configurable in a separate file. To illustrate, let's say we have our application. Our app is here. And let's say it's pointing to a database. Okay? This is our database. Now, to talk to this database, I have to have a value, and that is going to be my connection string. Okay? So, my application is going to use this connection string to access this database. But like we said, we don't want to hard code this into our application because we might have different databases based on the environment. So what we need is to store this connection string in a separate file. So this would be our config file down here, and this will have the connection string value. So we'll have connection string here, and this would point to whatever, ABC server. It's our server name. Now, instead of this value coming from the application, it's going to be coming from this file. And the application would then talk to that config file and pull that value dynamically. Okay? So let's hop over to Visual Studio and kind of see this in action. So I'm in Visual Studio and I've created a simple console app, just a hello world. And what I want to do is I'm going to make an application that will see what time it is. And based on the time of day, it's going to display a different message, such as good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. But let's say I didn't want to hard code those messages, those greetings based on morning, noon, or night. I want to make it configurable. So let's get started. So let's say, first things first, we need to add a configuration file. So I'm going to go to Add, New Item, Application Configuration File, or an app.config. So now we have our app.config. And in our configuration, this is essentially an XML file. And we're going to have a new section called App Settings. And under App Settings, you have to add keys. So the first key, let's say we're going to add, and the key is going to be a morning message. Okay? And it's going to have a value, and let's say it's going to say good morning, and then we're going to do a placeholder with the bracket 0, that's dynamically, we can use a string format to populate the value of that zero indexed bookmark, and we'll show how that works. So we're going to do good morning 0 exclamation point, and now I'm going to copy paste these 3 and make this afternoon message and evening message, and it's going to say good afternoon and good evening. So now in our program CS, this is going to be pretty simple. We're just going to grab the current hour from the datetime object. So let's say var current hour equals datetime.now.hour. And now I can just do a simple if statement to show the different messages based on that. First off, let's create a variable to store our current message. So var message equals just a string dot empty for now. Then we're going to populate it based on the current hour. So if current hour, let's say it's going to be greater than, let's say if it's 5 a.m., so if it's greater than or equal to 5, and current hour is less than or equal to let's say 12. So from 5 a.m. to noon, we're going to say the morning message. So message equals, and we're going to do configuration manager. And we can see it's not found. So what we have to do is install this package for configuration manager. So let's go find and install latest. That adds system.configuration to our project. You could also go to dependencies, right click and go to add com reference, and then you can go down and select the system.configuration assembly as well. So now that we have system.configuration, we can do configuration manager dot app settings, and again that corresponds to the app settings tag that we added in our app config. So we can see the available options are this morning message, afternoon, or evening. So I want morning, right? We're saying if it's between 5 and noon, then grab the morning message, okay? And then we're going to do an else if, let's say it's greater than 12 and less than or equal to let's say 5 p.m., which would be 17 because it goes by military time. So between noon and 5 p.m., it's going to say the afternoon message. Just to be sure, let's copy paste it directly from our app config. Make sure we don't mistype anything. And then finally, the else case, we don't need to do any kind of conditional logic around this because we've already bounded our hours for morning and afternoon. So anything else is going to be evening, and we will display the evening message. So message equals configuration manager, app settings, and there we go. And then finally, we need to do a console.writeLine message. And that's our whole app. So let's give it a shot. Let's take a look. And we can see we forgot something. So it says good morning 0 still. So let's fix that. So I'm going to add one more key to my app config, and that's going to be, let's just call it name. So now ideally, you probably wouldn't store someone's name in a config, that would be more of a user input thing where when signing up for the application or the website, they would enter their username and you could then print it there dynamically. But for this example, we're learning about app settings and configuration files. So I'm going to set, and I did this wrong, let's say this is name and the value is Chris. So now let's create a new variable up here for var name equals configuration manager app settings name. There we go. And now, instead of just right-lining message, what I'm going to do is a string.format. I'm passing in the message, and then we have a list of arguments after that string, where each variable we specify after that string is going to be an argument that can go into this string. So, and it's all zero-based, like everything in programming. So the 0 means the first argument. That value is going to be placed here. And then if I needed more than just one value, I could do like a bracket 1, bracket 2, bracket 3, and so on. And then I could specify more and more strings to go here dynamically. But for this one, we're just using the 1. So I'm doing a string.format message, and in that 0 position, I'm going to populate it with name. And again, that name is coming from our configuration settings labeled name. Okay, so now let's run it. And it worked. So we can see, good afternoon, Chris. So, and at the time of recording this, it's 5:09 p.m. So we are within the 5 o'clock hour. So it's giving us our afternoon message. Okay? Now, the last thing to note is that when this builds, it's going to output this config file into the bin folder. It's going to get created as your app.exe name .config. So, and that .config file, as we saw, is just an XML. So you're going to have your executable, and then you're going to have this config file that sits next to it that you can actually go and edit these values without having to recompile your application. So in this example, we looked at a configuration file for a console application, but the same goes for a web application as well. Instead of this app.config, you're going to have a web.config, but they behave the same way. And to access it, it's the same library. You're going to use the system.configuration to access that. Now, this is in the .NET Framework world, but there's also the .NET Core world, which is the cross-platform version of .NET. So if you're working with console apps or web apps in the .NET Framework, you're going to be using app.config or web.config. But now I'm going to create a new project that's .NET Core, and we'll see how config files are handled there. All right, so I created a .NET Core MVC web application. And out of the box, you can see we have this appsettings.json file. This is our configuration file that actually comes standard with our project. So it's ready to go. So actually, right here in this JSON, I can go ahead and add the values we're going to need. And let's build something similar. So we're going to have our morning message, and it's going to say, good morning, 0, exclamation point. And let's copy paste this a couple times. This will be our afternoon message and our evening message. Okay. Now, the only difference is, well, there's a couple differences. Instead of a XML config file, we're now working with a JSON file. And then to access it, we no longer use system.configuration. Instead, we are going to inject an iConfiguration service into our controller and then use that to access those values. So we're in the home controller. I'm going to do a private read-only I configuration. You can see it actually tries to populate it for me. That's what we need. And then we're going to bring it into our constructor. So that will be injected into our home controller, and then we can access it. So on index, which is going to be that default home screen, let's do our same logic. So we're going to say current hour equals datetime.now.hour. Oh, one other thing. In keeping with the way we built this, let's say the name is in this config file as well. So I can say var name equals, I'm going to use this configuration service to fetch my value. So I can do a get value, and it is going to be of type string, and the key is name. Now let's say our message is an empty string, and if current hour greater than equal to 5 and current hour is less than or equal to 12, then our message equals configuration get value of type string, and we're going to get morning message. Let's copy for the else, and I think this one we said greater than 12 and less than or equal to 17, which would be 5 p.m. That's going to be the afternoon message. And finally, message equals configuration get value of type string, and this is our evening message. And now to get this to print on our screen, we are going to use a view bag. So let's say viewBag.message equals string.format message name. This is the server-side code for our application. The last thing we're going to do is actually display this viewBag message on our page. So we're going to views, home, index, and instead of this welcome here, I'm going to display the viewBag message. So let's give it a shot. And it worked. So in the last example, we made a console application using the .NET framework where we stored it in an app config file. In this case, it's a web project using .NET Core, and we used an app settings.json. But you can see conceptually they accomplish the same thing, where we have our built application that's compiled, and we have a separate file that we can edit to change those values as needed. Maybe it's per environment, or if things change, it's a value that needs to be dynamic. We can do that with configuration files. So there's no homework this week, but I did want to finish out with a little bit of a story. So my first job out of college, first off, in college, they never talked about the concept of configuration files with us. That was a foreign thing. Everything that we had done had been hard-coded. So at my first job, everything I did was hard-coded as well. Well, I built an application that ran overnight and processed jobs. So it would download files from an FTP server, and then it would process each one of those files and move the data from the file into the database. Well, in the event that a file couldn't be processed, I thought it'd be really cool if it could send me a text message. So I did a try-catch, and if it caught that exception, it would then send an email, which is an SMS text message. It's just an email. So it would send that email that would go to my phone to tell me something happened. I was really proud of it. I thought it was really cool if Overnight, I could get notified if my application had an error. The next morning, I could go through my text messages and fix anything that happened. Well, I hard-coded that application with my phone number. So guess what happened? So a few years later, I left that job and went on to a new place, but that application was still hard-coded with my phone number. And that's bad. So suddenly in the middle of the night, years later, I got like 2,000 or 3,000 text messages overnight where my application actually got stuck, where it was one record that was bad and it kept trying to process it over and over and over. So it would pick up the file, bomb out, send me a text message. Pick up a file, bomb out, send me a text message. And then did this over and over and over. And since it wasn't a configuration file, it wasn't a simple fix to get my phone number out of there. They actually had to find a developer that knew how to get into the code, change that phone number, put it in a configuration file, and then redeploy the application. So that was my hard-earned lesson in configuration files and the importance of them. So please take these words of wisdom. Use configuration files whenever possible. That's all I got for now. We'll see you next time.